And I think we should be live at the moment. Let me double check. Pardon me if I cause any sort of microphone looping here. For those of you that are here and can hear me, thank you so much for making the space to join us today. I do want to give folks just a minute or two to hop in before we kick things off formally. So thank you for being early. We'll get started in just one moment. And I still do not show us live in LinkedIn, guys. Oh, here we go. Here we go. Okay, we are officially live. Kevin Shawinski, Modulos, Shea Brown, Babel AI. Guys, thank you so much for joining me again today. Super, super grateful for you. For those listeners, those watchers with us this morning, the three of us have been having ongoing conversations around what has been, as you very likely know, a growing rift, a growing divide between the focus of EU related AI regulation and US related AI regulation. What we're seeing more recently, however, is that macroscopic view of the division is becoming even more pronounced at the microscopic view internally to each of these regions. The Hermetic principle, as above, so below. I think we're seeing play out very definitely day to day as we continue to track changes in regulation. Kevin, you have really kept your finger on the pulse of what's happening with some of the conversations around enforcement of various stages of the EU AI Act. I don't know if you'd care to open up and just share a little bit with the audience what you're seeing and what you see playing out.
Sure, and thank you, Patrick, for organizing this webinar, and it's great to be here. So what's happening with the EU AI Act sort of very rapidly devolves into a sort of inside baseball of what's happening at the European Union and how the EU and the United States are now discussing, clashing over digital legislation. I'll just give a brief overview of events of how we got here, and then speculate maybe just a little bit about what we can expect from here on out. So the EUA Act passed into law in 2024, and the most important deadline in the Act was and continues to be set for 2nd of August 2026. That's when high-risk AI systems available in the EU have to have completed their process of obtaining a CE mark, have a conformity assessment done, and drawn up their technical documentation. So this is not the start date, this is the end date. And because the AI Act is a product liability regime, it means if you don't have those, you cannot be on the EU market. And it is sufficient for that, for a company that's outside the EU, if an EU resident could either become a customer or if an employee is based in the EU. So it's a very extraterritorial regime. Then a couple of weeks ago, under pressure from industry, from some member states, and yes, the United States, the EU Commission, which is like the executive of the EU, proposed an omnibus legislation. So this is a new bill to be passed by the EU, proposed by the Commission, to do a number of things to change how GDPR works, to change some things about the AI Act, and in particular, to push back the deadline of 2nd of August by 12 to 18 months, but reserving the right to pull it back forward. So you already have a complex proposal that, yes, might push the deadline, but actually doesn't reduce the uncertainty for businesses that people were asking for.
And Kevin, isn't legal certainty one of the hallmarks of how we should be thinking about regulation?
Exactly. You should know when the deadline is and what applies. And this proposal doesn't actually do that. So this was poorly received by significant parts of the European Parliament. And as a reminder, this omnibus legislation it's a new law. So it has to go through the whole process of the EU legislation. It has to be passed by the Parliament. It has to be passed by the Council, which is like the upper house or the Senate, for it to pass into law. And typically, that process takes 12 to 18 months. It can be compressed in emergency situations. For example, when the COVID bailouts happened. But the AI Act deadline is 8 months away. So this is already at the edge of what's physically possible for the EU process to do. Then the Ombudsman of the EU came out with a bad. They're an end run basically around democracy. And so just saying, oh, it's urgent and business needs this, this is no reason to rush through legislation. And then, because that wasn't complex enough, the EU Commission decided to issue a fine under another EU regulation of 120 million euros against X, with predictable consequences of not just Elon Musk blowing up, but the US government taking a very hard stance against European tech legislation in general. And so now we're in a position where, on the one hand, if the AI Act deadline is supposed to be moved, there's almost no time left. You would have to have everyone on board and say this is urgent, needs to be done. This is not given. The Parliament objects. The Ombudsman said this is a bad process. And now, of course, any concession that looks like it might be something that happens under US pressure is politically toxic. And so now we're stuck in this position where, yeah, we have a legal deadline. We're trying to move it to accommodate business, but it's probably politically impossible.
And then, Kevin, I think one more layer that's important for organizations to understand, because they very likely know this, that they very likely feel this. As we think about high-risk systems and the requirement to have a QMS in place, we don't yet know the final standard that will be required for that high-risk QMS. We do have really good insight in the published drafts. They're out for inquiry today. So those that are interested can view them. They're publicly posted. But that said, we still don't have a clear understanding of what the final standard will look like for those organizations that do have to earn their CE mark.
Mm-hmm. That's another constraint. That's another challenge for businesses. And that's actually one of the reasons the Commission put forward for saying we should move the deadline, because those standards are not ready. And the response from the Parliament, at least parts of the Parliament, has been, yeah, the standards are nice, but you don't need them to comply to the law. And in any case, this gets now very inside baseball. There's another procedure that the Commission could execute if they wanted to, but it is also politically toxic.
Political toxicity. That said, that's an easy pivot over to Shea Brown. So I guess it was a week ago, the most recent EO was signed. You and I were actually texting back and forth. And so my knee jerk was, well, here we go. But Shea, after reading the executive order, you had some nuanced thoughts about really what we should expect in the coming days, weeks, and months associated with rollbacks, not rollbacks, whatever the case may be, with state level AI regulation. I don't know if you'd care to share just a little bit about the executive order and kind of your opinion of where we're headed.
Yeah. So, I mean, I wouldn't call it nuanced. Like, I think the executive order was, trying to do what has been tried already by trying to pass preemptions. And so the gist of it is current administration does not like states trying to regulate AI, given how interstate AI is, and obviously it's global. And so they are trying to preempt this, or they have been trying to preempt this, but without any kind of like federal answer, which would be what's needed if you were going to try to preempt the state's ability. And the easiest thing is to just pass a federal law, and that will preempt anyway. And so it's been tried. It's been, even in the sort of the administration's own party has pushed back against it, and there still is pushback. So this executive order is an attempt to just let's go straight to it. The thing is, what it's really trying to say is, basically, we don't want state laws of this type, and the way we're going to get that done is to essentially try to restrict funding for states that are going to enact or enforce laws that they view are discriminatory in different ways. And they called out the Colorado law in particular. And so there's a sort of a funding restriction. And then they also have a task force for litigation to actually go after some of these states. So that's in the executive order that formed this task force. And then the administration is going to work with Congress to try to pass a federal regulation. So that's the other bit. And so after reading it, my view is I don't think very much is going to change. I think basically the big states that are passing laws or have passed laws are mostly controlled by Democrats. I think that a lot of those states are not going to be interested in not enforcing those laws, and I think that they're not as interested in the financial being penalized financially because of getting some of this funding, which is not very big, especially for those relative to the budgets of those states. And in terms of what I'm seeing from businesses, people are not really getting swayed as much as I would have thought. Enterprises have had a very long plan in place, the ones that are serious,
Yes.
already for the EUA Act, and they're going to go despite the omnibus, they're still planning for pretty strict compliance because they know that eventually it's going to settle that way. And they are not going to have one regime for Europe and another for America in terms of governance. And so and then small companies, yes, there will be a few of them will be like, okay, we're just not going to do anything. Here's the omnibus. Here's this preemption executive order or trying to do preemption. And people aren't at the moment enforcing state laws, or state and local laws as much. We're not seeing a ton of enforcement there. And a lot of them haven't kicked in. So smaller companies may try to skirt this and just not do anything. But I think the serious companies and the smart startups are all just doing the same thing that they're going to be doing. And I think we will see state level enforcement once those deadlines kick in. So that's my not so nuanced response.
Well, and to that end, Shea, so the smart companies, those companies committed to first principles are doing the right things. And Kevin, I'm assuming, so I'll ask, I'm assuming you're kind of seeing the same thing in Europe as you're working with your customers, your colleagues.
There's an awareness, yes, that there should be a plan or there is a plan. I think there is, for those companies dealing with high-risk AI system, I think there is still not a full appreciation to the degree of how much work it's going to be.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's also a worry that I now hear from a number of companies, and I think this is well-founded, that the EU bodies that are supposed to approve those systems, that they're not going to be ready in time, and that there might be a logjam, and there's going to be a need for, at least as a stopgap measure, ways to a third party assess AI systems so that business deals can continue. So I'm talking to a number of companies that are putting high-risk systems on the market, and they're either in a sales process or in a renewal process with a big client. And the client basically demands that they show that they quote unquote comply with the EU AI Act. And they're not sure, even if they meet all their internal checks, how they will be able to validate that to their customer in time. And that's yet another challenge that I see. That's I think about to become a really real pain point.
Well, and Kevin, and that brings up another nuance that I think many in the U.S. are unaware of, and that's the process to earn the CE mark. I think most of our European listeners are very, very familiar with this. But for those in the U.S., the CE mark is essentially earned by undergoing validation through what's called a notified body. It's a practice that's been in place for some time, specifically associated with product. I think we see things are a little bit different now with some AI systems that are more intangible than tangible. But specifically for those systems, we see in the Act, I think it's Annex 3, Kev, calls out a subset of AI providers that won't necessarily go through a notified body, but will have an opportunity to evaluate themselves, attest, and then earn their CE mark. Maybe if you could talk just a little bit about that and why that might be something that's also delaying the push forward or the willingness to push back on the push forward.
I mean, you described it really well. So not everybody has to go through the notified body route. But under the AI Act, if what you submit, if what you represent contains errors, that already can result in very serious fines. And of course, that is something you want to avoid. And so I think there's a significant need for non-notified body attestations, audits, certifications from trusted bodies, because one thing you see a lot of EU startups do is they make up their own AI Act compliant badge and they put it on their website, they put it in a slide deck, and they're like, sure, we're AI Act compliant. And of course, the moment you ask them what that means, it says like, nothing really. We just ask the graphic designer to make it, and that's not going to cut it, right? That's for an enterprise buyer that thinks about bringing in software, bringing on an AI system that could also put risks on themselves. That's not going to be good enough.
Yeah, and that said, guys, just a moment ago, we kind of talked about first principles and the larger, Shea, you mentioned the larger organizations are continuing on the path that they're on. For those organizations that do see chaos, for lack of better words, chaos in the expectations, in the burden that they will carry, what are the things that they can be doing to begin building that internal governance program that allows them to be successful if and when every regulation drops, enforcement for everything actually comes to fruition?
I want to double down on what Kevin said real quick about
Please.
not furnishing. So the one thing you don't want to do is to say you're compliant when you're not, or to because in the face of, this is my opinion, okay, so I don't know how true or relevant this might be, but my opinion is, in the face of this uncertainty, I don't feel like the European Commission is going to just start going after people for nuanced parts of, Chapter 3 obligations about accuracy and things like this, right? Things that require some nuance when there's no harmonized standards. However, the one thing that is very easy to go after people for is the explicit fine you get when you furnish incorrect information to them, which is something like 7 million euro or whatever. It's kind of like the minimum. And so in my mind, what that would tell me as a business is, don't say anything that isn't true. And it's okay to say things that you do X, Y, and make sure that you actually do them. And then don't make any claims about that being compliant or not with a particular article or whatever. I would just say that's one thing I wouldn't do. But what I would do is focus on some of the core first principles. And so you need to have a quality management system. You're going to have to. That quality management system is going to need to have a risk management system, which follows roughly Article 9. And then there's going to have to be a clear sort of transparency things. There's going to have to be some testing and evaluation, some ongoing monitoring, some very basic things, right? And there's going to be a ton of overlap, and there are going to be nuances, and the harmonized standards will say more specific things about it. But those are the things that just need to exist and probably should exist anyway to mitigate risk. So just pick something, and ideally 42001 is the perfect starting point because it's a standard and you can get certified against it. Just pick a thing and go with it and try to implement it well. Like, don't try to boil the ocean. Just do a few things and do them well. And and try to get the sort of grease the gears in your organization so that everybody gets used to that, so that you can pivot and you can change, which is the nice thing about a management system like ISO 42001, is it explicitly wants you to change and have a mechanism for improving the system, and just say, okay, we will respond when the EU figures out what's happening. But for right now, let's just grease those gears and get that quality management system, which will be, let's say, the AI management system. Don't worry about the hemming and hawing of Sensenilac. Yes, okay, it's not perfect, but there's the overlap is significant with the current standard draft that's out, and implement a really good risk management system that's similar to Article 9, and get your technical controls in place in terms of testing, monitoring, and mitigations, and just then wait and see. It feels like you can't get much better than that. You can't, don't over-engineer it.
And I think over-engineering it is really a risk for people. You mentioned boiling the ocean, Shea, and I would say that's kind of a shared sentiment for a lot of compliance executives, traditional executives that are juggling, trying to understand these regulations today. Just really quickly, you mentioned a quality management system, and this is a point of confusion that I hear a lot. So just to say this out loud, when we say quality management system in the context of the EU AI Act, we're not necessarily talking about quality management in the context of reducing errors. I mean, that's part of a good management system. What we're talking about with quality management system in regard to the AI Act is fidelity, conformity to the expectation of the act itself. And so when we look at the current draft, as we mentioned earlier, the current draft for high-risk QMS quality management system that's available for public view, it's PREN 18286. What you'll see is a management system framework very much like what we have in ISO 42001. To be absolutely plain, there are some significant differences, Shea, to your point, where the act requires more depth and more breadth with some associated controls. But largely what we see is a framework that takes 42001 and adds what's necessary to create the specificity needed to meet the intent of the act. Yeah, and just a quick reminder, those of you that do have questions, please feel free to drop them in. Shea made a note. Yeah, I'll probably say this a few times throughout our session, but any questions, please let us know. We're happy to discuss. Now, Kevin, earlier this week, you sent me a note that was essentially a U.S. agency, not necessarily firing shots, but maybe firing shots a little bit at European regulators. Maybe you could tell us just a little bit about that and what you think the intent might have been, if you care to assume.
So right now we sort of see this return fire between the US government and the EU on the topic of digital regulation, digital taxes. It's about economic and political interest. It's not a technical discussion. It's not a question of we don't like this particular article of the AI Act because of some a technical reason. It's a discussion at the political level, and I think that's the first thing we need to acknowledge. And the US is representing its interests and making sure American businesses can do business in Europe as freely as possible. And the EU is representing its interests to say, well, if you do business in Europe, if you're on the market, you have to follow our rules. And there's a clash here that has roots, of course, in other political questions right now, which is why, us three here who talk about quality management systems for AI, it's sort of several levels higher, but I think it's really important here. These are political and these are emotional discussions, and they ultimately are about economics and market access. And so one of the challenges for business leaders that I see now very clearly on the near-term horizon is friction and divergence between regulatory spaces. So the EU is going to dig in its heels and say, we're not going to change because that looks like caving to the US. And the US at the same time will say, we'll dig in its heels as well and say, like, no, we have a vision for how AI should work. And in the US, of course, it's interesting because that happens both at the federal level and at the state level. And so the landing zone we have now, a significant risk of ending up at, is where a business leaders will have to say, so I have this one AI system, this one product. I'd love to just operate it globally.
Yes.
But I can't, because the divergence between what the Europeans expect, what the US federal government expect, what the Colorado government expects, those are going to start diverging, and you're going to have to think very carefully about what you deploy where. And of course, the number one tool that supports companies in managing that difficulty is a good quality management system.
Yeah, and one of the things, Kevin, you mentioned emotion being part of the decision-making process. I think we all recognize that's the case. We don't like to admit it, but it's true. You know, I think about the philosophical gap between not just state regulation and federal regulation, soon to be federal regulation here in the US, but also what we see in Europe. And that is, one group is focused very much on competition, while another group is focused very much on caution. And it feels as if these two camps have decided they're at cross purposes and there is no way to meet in the middle, which I think may be very, very incorrect for what it's worth. I do see having a structured management system, quality management system, AI management system, whatever we want to call it. I do see that structured management system as a mechanism to let organizations clarify for themselves their business case, their business justification for development and use of AI, and then adapt and modify as these external forces begin to really press against the economy that these organizations are working within. And guys, we do have a couple of questions here. First of all, there are many types of AI risk. Is certifying the training quality of AI models part of what companies need to show according to EU and US regulations, in addition to data integrity, privacy, IP, security, governance, et cetera? So ultimately, the question is, are US or EU-based organizations on the hook to validate the quality of the training of their AI models?
I mean, I would say yes. I think I'm assuming what they mean by training, quality of the training, is that it's related to something like a validity, where, you know, this thing that I'm training is making some inference, which I'm using to then do a thing in the world, hire a person, or, you know, determine whether someone gets social services or whatever. And the quality of the training is related to, is that a valid inference given the data that I'm training it on, and so on. And so I think that I know definitely in US regulations, in some areas like hiring, for instance, in areas like any sort of automated decision tools, like under the sort of brand new California regulations, validity is going to be an issue. And similarly in EUA Act under Article 15, I think that the accuracy, robustness, I don't know if validity gets mentioned explicitly there, but I think there is a significant risk. And I think the assumption is that these tools are making valid inferences. The problem, of course, comes when you are using a foundational model that is, you don't have access or control or visibility at all into what that training is or has been. And it is, in some sense, the validity that you're going to use, the testing you're going to use to demonstrate validity, is going to be much more about the infrastructure around the testing and evaluation and the quality of how you evaluate that system. And you're going to have to treat it essentially as a black box. And whether that flies with regulators or not, I think remains to be seen. But this is kind of my interpretation anyway.
And I would go back to something, Shea, that you said, which is that at least initially, I think regulators will be lenient as long as you can show best effort. I think there's no expectation of perfection or expensive testing programs, but especially if you're a smaller organization, evidence that you've thought about the problem and try to do something reasonable about it and have documented it. I think that's probably the most important thing.
And then, Kevin, as it relates to thinking about the problem, thinking about risks, which is kind of how this question was framed up. What are organizations doing today to, first of all, identify, rank, and then document the risks that they're facing as they develop and use some of these models?
So I have some strong views on how to deal with AI risk, and it comes down to the question that the sort of traditional risk exercises we're all familiar with. We have like a 5x5 matrix, and we say that the impact is high and the likelihood is medium, and we pat ourselves on the back and say risk managed for another quarter. That in the world of AI, that is changing rapidly and that is business critical, that's not enough. And so the way I advise organizations and governments to think about AI risk is it's a continuous process. You should always be assessing it. And you should quantify it. You should really put a monetary figure on it, euros, dollars, francs, whatever it is. Not because you can do it accurately. You can't in most cases. It's an estimate. But it gives you a sense of the pain, and it gives you a sense of, well, it would cost this much to reduce the risk. Is it worth doing? Is it feasible? So it gives you something you can measure and you can communicate. And you should split that up, that risk, into a clear taxonomy. You should understand what your risks are and the threat vectors through which they come in.
Agreed.
And there are great taxonomies out there. I'm a big believer that every organization, they can start with one of those public ones, but they should make their own, because the simple act of deciding what are my risks, what are my threats, and how much money is at risk is extremely illuminating and will make your product better and will make your business better. And as a side effect, meet what the regulator wants to see.
Well, and to your point, I think by framing risk in the context of dollars, euros, whatever the case may be, you're necessarily stepping into the language of business, which can help affect a positive change in how organizational decisions are made. And then, Kevin, forgive me if I'm misremembering, but it feels like you've developed a tool that can assess risk. Is that something that you feel comfortable talking about?
I'm happy to show it here and also share the link if you like. So this is ongoing sort of research and development that we're doing on quantifying risk. So you can see shared screen here. So we built this tool as a simple version. We have a much more sophisticated version of it as well, using a proprietary risk database. But you can basically get an idea in quantitative terms if you have a certain type of AI deployment in a certain market, in an industry, what kind of data you're processing, whether you're deploying or you're the provider yourself. You can get an estimate of what that ultimately looks like. And you can run it through this agent. There's sort of a lot of tech wizardry behind it, but you can get a quantitative estimate. So if you run the system under these conditions, you should expect a loss, a worst case loss of 5 million euros in this case that I ran, and we break it down by category. And then, of course, our agent can explain to you exactly where those risks came from and how it argued about them. So, for example, you can go all the way into your why inaccurate or unreliable model predictions in this scenario, why that gives you an expected loss of 1.2 million euros here. You can run this yourself. I'm happy to post the link. But this is only a starting point because, if we go back to the input form here, it's very crude. To run this properly, you should be getting inputs from your documentation, your logs, your quality management system, and then you'll get a much better estimate.
And then, Kevin, is this run on a use case by use case basis?
Yes, this is for individual AI systems. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, very, very cool. And this concept of use case by use case, I've not been shocked. That's the wrong word. That sounds too dramatic, but it's been really interesting to me with the organizations that I've spoken with, the lack of clarity and understanding around how they're actually using AI, both internally to generate value and as they engage with their customers to create value in the market. And so this concept of use cases, though it shouldn't feel foreign, does feel foreign to many organizations. Shea, I know you do a ton of consulting work along with your audit practice. Is this something that you're seeing as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the first things that people have to handle is how are they going to be aware of risk and what's the unit of analysis, right? And sometimes an AI system is like a really fixed project that they're building something and for a very particular purpose and it's well documented. Other times it's just like a plug-in on your browser or something that a person just happened to pull in off the web and it serves many purposes, like a very general purpose, like ChatGPT or Claude or something like that. And so that unit of analysis is something that it is a little bit difficult to get your mind around. And then what to do once you've identified a use case, what's the next step, right? How do I know whether it's risky or not? Who am I talking to? Like who in the organization is qualified to understand that? Is it the people building it? Is it the people that asked for it? Is it centralized? And so there's questions between like, do I have a centralized kind of risk categorization function, like a person or a system? Do I have it federated where they're going to do it at the end point? It depends on the size of the organization. And then what do I do after I've determined this is high risk? And high risk meaning under some rubric, which could be the EU's rubric. It could be maybe that's just high financial risk. My company's relying on the outputs. What's the next step? And I think risk assessment in a very detailed way and to the way Kevin mentions is like actually put some hard numbers to it. What happens, what's the likelihood I'm going to get sued if I misidentify somebody can't get into her account because I couldn't recognize their face. And that's going to be tied to, let's say, the false negative rate. That's a number you can measure. And you can track those sorts of things. People are not there yet at that level. Most companies are not at the level where they're quantifying things to the point of they have a real risk. That risk is tied to a feature of my system. That feature of my system can be tracked via a metric, which has a really clearly defined way of being measured and tracked. And then we're going to track that metric and then feed it back into the risk. That loop really has not, most organizations haven't gotten to that point. And many of them are at the point of how do I define a use case and what to do after.
And what I love about 42001 as a management system, as a QMS or AIMS, whichever language you prefer, is that it requires organizations to actually walk this process.
Yeah, absolutely. I think 42001 is wonderful in so many ways. And the clause 4 is great because that it forces the leadership to really think about what's our exposure? Who cares about this system that we are deploying or using, like either deploying or providing? What stakeholders are out there? What do they care about? What are the regulators? All of that stuff. And then it's really a wonderful kind of chronological process of like, how do we plan out what's important? And I think people do get overwhelmed by trying to make this up themselves. And I think you just take something that's already been written for you and walk through that process. Even if you don't end up getting certified against it, it's just a great rubric to follow, a procedural framework to follow.
I want to stress one point that Shea, that you touched on here, and I think is very important. There's a difference, and something that gets conflated a lot in discussions. So certainly I have. There's a big difference between business risk and legal risk categorization under the AI Act or other laws. And so when some of the organizations that I work with, they have high risk applications under the AI Act, but those are by far not the highest risk AI applications to the business. Those can be applications that in no way would be considered legally high risk, but if they fail, it's catastrophic for the business. And so when you think about AI risk, cleanly separate legal classification, very important, you cannot get it wrong, from business risk. Don't forget the systems that have a limited risk tag next to them, but if the system fails, your business goes under.
And another risk that we haven't yet spoken about, and Shea, Kev, one of you mentioned this earlier, but the reality that we're unlikely to see regulatory fines in the very near future for most organizations, specifically around the AI Act. But if I'm not mistaken, I feel like the AI Act also has private right of action. So there is still very real risk for organizations that are placing high risk systems on the market without a proper QMS in place. Am I misinterpreting that, Kev?
Our good friend Peter Henze pointed this out to us. So yeah, I think unless you're a major tech company, I would I would be less concerned about the EU Commission or the Spanish AI regulator showing up on your door on August 3rd and handing you fines. This is an important difference to GDPR, where you can violate GDPR. Somebody has to complain. There'll be an investigation, and a couple of years later, it'll resolve, and maybe you pay a fine or you don't. Because the AI Act turns AI into a product liability regime, it means you have to have a legal basis for being on the market in the first place. And so if there's a legal dispute, and it can be a frivolous one, it can be one of your competitors filing a frivolous lawsuit somewhere in Europe, the first thing the court will ask is, where is your conformity assessment? Where's your technical documentation? Where's your CE mark? And if you cannot produce them, you are off the market, and it'll take you 12 to 18 months to, first of all, produce them, get them approved, and convince the court to let you operate again. And that is probably in many ways more catastrophic than a fine.
Yeah. I mean, I think for US companies, private right of action is a real worry. I mean, even what was it? I think SB 243, the California just recently passed, which is for AI companion chatbots, right? And there's been obviously some tragic outcomes from especially young people interacting with those chatbots. Law has a private right of action, and so that means they can, if you're not complying with that you can be sued by people that are impacted. And I think just litigation in general is a problem. We see with the Workday lawsuits, FX radio lawsuits around hiring. Those are big problems. There's liability there, and liability law is applies to AI, or can, and so I think there's that liability risk is one that has to be considered. What's the likelihood that I'm going to harm someone to the point where they're going to seek recourse? They're going to look for money from my company. And it does, to Kevin's point about this categorization and thinking between compliance and business risk, you really have to think holistically about all of these different risks together. Operational loss, if things don't work, what happens if I spend all this money on a AI system and nobody's using it, or people are trying to use it internally and they're just not getting the efficiency, and then I'm losing money. Trying to think holistically about the risk and not focus solely on compliance or liability or safety, but they're all combined, and it adds up. And if you just think of one and not the other, it does offer a lot of blind spots. And that is hard. It's very hard, especially if you are working across jurisdictions, which if you have a website, you probably are. And so that's a big worry.
And we're all familiar with these studies, like the MIT one and others, saying 90% of AI initiatives fail. And I think it goes, when when you think about it, it goes down to what you just described. People ascribe a huge ROI or economic gain from implementing an AI system. They never bother to calculate the risk and realize that actually the risk is far higher than the gain they hope for. And so the risk-adjusted ROI was terrible to begin with, and they should have either just not done the project or de-risked it before starting. And I think if people think about AI projects this way, then the percentage of AI initiatives that fail will drop significantly.
And I guess that's another area, Shea, you brought up clause 4 of 42001, where we really set the context of the organization. That's another way in which 42001 gives organizations a way to not fill in the blank, but to work with a known good structure to be thinking about these risks and how those risks will actually evidence themselves inside their organization if they don't apply good governance and management practices. Really quickly, Shea, a few years ago on one of your lunchtime babblings, I don't remember when it was, it feels like a few years ago, but on one of your lunchtime babbling episodes, you mentioned this idea of race with AI. We have a question from the audience. Do you think a global AI treaty, similar to a nuclear arms treaty, will need to be multinationally agreed upon to ensure AI safety due to geopolitical concerns? Ultimately, are we looking at a place, are we coming to a place where treaties are our only mechanism to work well together?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm definitely not qualified to answer that question, but I will say, like, I think clearly it's a global force. AI is a global force. I mean, we have, yeah, and I'm gonna get very armchair here, so take it with everything with a grain of salt. Like, I think the internet, cloud, commerce, financial, the way financial transactions are managed globally, we are very interconnected in a way that makes our life very convenient, at least in most parts of the world, or the developed parts of the world. Okay, so, and that has been great, but what that means is the risk associated with that is huge. And, you know, cybersecurity has grown from the realization that things can go really bad, and when they do, they propagate very, very quickly and can have a huge economic impact. And so now we're dealing with the potential for really very intelligent, bad artificial actors propagating through this system. And it is a global problem. And so my feeling is we do have to have some global solutions similar to what we did with nuclear weapons. It's not to say I'm like a doomer or anything, but I do think we need to have some sensible guardrails and shared understanding of what is acceptable and what we want to avoid in this massively interconnected systems, and what each individual nation state has to do or has obligations to do internally to make sure that they are keeping up with that. And so that's just my armchair gut reaction to this. I don't think business solves this. I don't think that free markets and sort of like self-interest motivated sort of equilibrium, which people are hoping for or strive for, is going to fix this particular problem.
There is I don't want to say global, but a very widespread treaty. It's the the Council of Europe's AI Convention, which was signed by basically all countries in Europe, United States, Canada, Japan, not China, but is fairly widely adopted. The problem with it has almost no content, and so it doesn't really. It names some of the problems, but its recommendations are so superficial that it doesn't really do anything. It says, yes, AI risk management is a good thing, and you should probably do it. And, I think we can all agree to that, but that's not effective.
What does that mean? What does that mean? Yeah, and Shea, you mentioned systems, and we are part of a global system, whether we like it or not. All of our economies are linked. It just is what it is. With systems, I think we're all familiar with the concept that systems have emergent properties, things that arise from the system that we couldn't couldn't have necessarily conceptualized before we see them. Another hallmark of systems is that systems traditionally resist change. So you push on a system and that system will push back, which I think is a little bit of what we're seeing play out across the world today. Again, with this drift and focus between competition and caution. Where do we really think the most important priorities lie? And kind of pivoting just a little bit, guys. So we've talked a lot about risk. We've talked a lot about the confusion at the micro and macro level. Maybe we spend just a little bit of our time remaining talking about what, at least I think, may be a good solution for organizations, even if it's not perfect. Perfect is the enemy of good. And I think good is really where we need to focus for most organizations today. And so that said, for me, good would be organizations relying on a known good standard like ISO 42001 to begin implementing governance and management of the development and use of AI in their organizations. Now, 42001 presupposes that we have a solid understanding of our use cases, that we have a solid understanding of the real business value of implementing AI via those use cases. With those things in place, we can think cleanly about the systems that make up those AI systems, that is the people, processes, and technology. We can think about our stakeholders and those that might feel some impact should our systems behave inappropriately. We can think about risk in a more holistic way. So for me, 42001 becomes the base that then we implement good risk management practices. ISO has a standard 23894 that can help with that. We implement good impact assessment practices. Also, 42005 from ISO can help us with that. And then we simply extend out the necessary controls needed to ensure that our scoping is inclusive of what's required by all of our stakeholders. I know that sounds overly simple, but in my mind, that's the place that we can start to ensure that we're actually taking productive steps forward and not just freezing because everything feels too big. Guys, I don't know your opinion on that. Happy for corrective feedback.
Anything is better than nothing. As long as you're thinking about the problem, you're already ahead. And in particular, one trap to avoid, because again, it's something I see a lot, is an argument that goes like this: oh, we just buy AI from reputable vendors, so I'm sure they've taken care of all the compliance and risk and whatever, and we can just use it. And in fact, we can just tell our 5,000 employees to just build agents by themselves, and it'll be fine. That's the one thing I would avoid.
What's the meme? A dumpster fire and the dog sitting there. This is fine. Yeah, yeah. I think that's what many organizations are dealing with today, unfortunately. And Shea, I think I saw you come off mute.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. I agree with Kevin, and that something is better than nothing, and just taking a moment to think about how you're going to manage your use of technology, period, but AI in particular, is a good step. And I think in terms of the frameworks out there, the sort of the governance frameworks, and there are many, ISO 42001 does feel like the one that is most likely to have market adoption, because if you're, especially if you're a small company and you're thinking, I'm investing time and money now, what's going to be paying dividends long term, it feels like the one that's the safest bet. Because NIST AI risk management framework is wonderful and it's a good supplement, but it's not, you're not going to get it audited against it, and it's voluntary, and there's a lot of freedom to choose things, and ISO is fairly rigid. There is still a lot of freedom, but it's rigid with the few things that it requires, and so it just gives you a really good framework for, let me just get those things that are required, and then I just patch in as I grow as an organization, and I change my scope, and I change the number of AI systems that I'm managing and that kind of thing. So it does make sense. But in the absence of nothing, like if you have nothing, something is better than nothing. So don't sweat the small stuff. Just pick a thing to do and do it. And my recommendation, which I always recommend, is if you've done nothing, just get somebody in your organization who's in charge of this, a person or maybe a group of people. Have them get an inventory of the AI systems you've used, have a rough categorization. It can be very basic, and then do a slightly deeper risk assessment so you understand, sort of broadly speaking, what are those risks of those systems, and then go from there. And you can do that without a management system, but that's probably the first thing you need to do anyway. And so if you've done nothing, start there.
Yeah, go ahead.
As a thought to add here, because I think it's very important. Nobody is good at this, right? The AI governance is new. There's nobody who has 20 years of experience with it and has perfected the process. Sometimes when I talk to organizations, they imagine that everyone else is, smooth sailing. They figure this out. They have a system. They click a few buttons and it's fine. It's just, this doesn't exist. Everybody is improvising right now and building and trying to figure out what works and what doesn't. And so even though maybe some consultants would disagree with that, there's no clean playbook that you can just execute and be fine.
Which I think is scary for folks, Kevin, quite frankly. I think we all want a known good model, a known good role model to build against. And to your point, that isn't necessarily there today.
I mean, it's funny, sometimes when I'm in conversations with potential customers, they'll ask me, so how many companies have you already helped comply with the EU AI Act? And I have to explain like that as of today, nobody in the world has done it or could, because the notified bodies aren't there. You can do your best preparation, but there is no validation of any process in the world.
Yes. Guys, as we begin wrapping up the session, we just have a couple minutes left. Any other key things, any other words of wisdom that you have to offer those that have chosen to join us today?
Yeah, I mean, no, there's no words of wisdom. I think to Kevin's point, like there aren't, like, I'm not an expert at this, and being intellectually humble and realizing that like there's so much to learn, there's so much to research, and that even if you like have a wonderful framework, your particular organization is unique, or your AI system is unique. And so focus on being the expert with your system, and don't be afraid to play a little jazz and kind of do some creative thinking around what are your unique risks and how you're going to manage them. Because I think there's intellectual property and there's enterprise value to be built in focusing on what you do and being very good at that. And I think I would say the only wisdom is stop looking elsewhere. Like there are some great examples, but at some point you need to go deep with your situation and apply what you've learned and what you're aware of and build there, because that is that time is more valuable than just like searching for every white paper or every regulation. You're going to have to look inward and get good at that. And so don't worry about the FOMO, just go deep with your organization and you're going to probably come up with something amazing.
And don't create your own private AI Act compliant badge. Just do not do that.
So number one, understand your context. Number two, don't create your own. Yeah, got it. Kevin, Shea, guys, as always, thank you. Thank you so much for not only thinking deeply about this stuff, but also sharing your opinion. I, as well as I think the entire market, appreciate it more than you know. For those that have joined us today, thank you. Recognize we kind of scheduled this without much lead time. That's just kind of how things are moving and working right now. So very grateful for everyone that took time out of their day to participate with us today. The recording will be on LinkedIn, as well as your comments. And should you need anything, please do not hesitate to reach out to any of us. We'll all help you any way that we can. Okay. Thank you all so much. I hope you have a great week.
Thank you.
Thank you all.